This podcast is created for farmers and powered by Pioneer Agronomy to bring you agronomic insights and proven solutions to fuel forward-thinking farming.
Hello and welcome to the July 31st edition of the Indiana Pioneer Agronomy podcast. I'm Brian Shrader, agronomist on the eastern side of the state of Indiana, joined as always by my co-host Carl Joern from Western Indiana. I was not trying to take your job there, Carl, at all. Just got my geography messed up this morning. How are you?
I'm good, but Brian, I was going to accuse you of invading here. It seems like on the podcast intros, we tend to play Risk. Every once in a while, we conquer territory that doesn't belong to us.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, I certainly did that today. I was looking at you while I was talking, and I got my brain all messed up. So, hey, it's been a couple weeks here since I've been able to join the podcast. Lots of things going on. I think today it will be a little bit of popcorn, as they say, as we bounce around from agronomic topic to agronomic topic. We've kind of entered into what maybe agronomically could be referred to as the dog days of summer, where we continue to drag on with certain diseases, new diseases show up, new problems, those kind of things. And so we'll try to address a few of those. But I guess I would be curious, and for the sake of our listeners, maybe an update from Western Indiana and what's going on in your territory and across the line in Illinois.
That's a great question. To your point, it feels like you have circular conversations at times, repeat yourself a lot this time of year. Here last week, we were sitting pretty wet across a lot of the geography. We eked out some rain out of a system that came through over the weekend, so I think we're feeling good. But there's, as always, pockets that could probably use the rainy forecast we have this week. I don't know about your app of choice, but when I look at the forecast for the week of the 29th, it seems like most days there's a coin flip in terms of a chance of getting a tenth or two here or there. So when you think about where our crops are at, this is peak water demand as you go through the reproductive stages. And so ensuring that we've got adequate soil moisture is important to ensure that we reach our yield potential. What we're finding in the fields is, since speaking with listeners last week, an awful lot more corn aphids than I recall speaking about in years gone by. Certainly seems as though there's a little pocket in east central Illinois, and as you keep tracking, a little bit further east into Indiana, it's becoming more and more common. For me, I think of kind of, around that, along Highway 24, as you come back from the Illinois border, and then all the way up to, call it Highway 14 on your east-west there, and keep taking it a little bit further to the east up to 231 or thereabouts, maybe 421 if you're driving along with me here, trucking through the tales of agronomy. But corn aphids, that's where the pocket is at this moment. So seeing a fair amount of aphids. We're seeing disease pressure continue to increase, tar spot. Let's see, what else are we finding in the fields? A little bit of brown stem rot in soybeans. Phytophthora pockets continue to grow. I mentioned last week as we were working our way out of those big precipitation events, low-lying areas continue to kind of take a beating. I think that's where we're going to see some yield taken off here is a result of having zeros in some of the bottom spots, and those bottom spots continue to grow with each really significant precipitation event. Not that tenth or two, but the couple inches is what was doing some harm there. So that's probably a fair summation of what's taking place across the Northwest Indiana, Northeast Illinois pocket, but there's plenty more for us to discuss here today, Brian. What's the latest as I move eastward?
Yeah, a lot of what you've talked about, we're a couple weeks behind where you were at in terms of tar spot. We have ramped up in the last 10 days or so on the eastern side of the state with pretty good pressure, at least across the geography that I cover. I have not found the corn aphids yet that you report on the east side of the state. Starting to get some reports of potential early frog eye, maybe some SDS in some areas starting to show up a little bit. Some concerns over the potential for smoke causing some issues with pollination and things like that. And so, and then some questions this week as folks have been out scouting corn. Common rust is quite easy to find now in many of the cornfields, but because of the hurricane and the conversation that came along with Hurricane Burl, lots of questions about how do I tell the difference between southern rust and common rust. And
Sure.
so, many of those questions as well. But realistically, the majority of my time as an agronomist the last 10 days has been spent really on tar spot, helping folks understand where to scout for it, how to scout for it, and then what do we make our treatment decisions based on. And so really, we've talked a lot about that in the podcast. It's just really the first time for many of the growers east of US 31 and south of, say, 24, where
Sure.
that's been a real common consideration now that has to be looked at and done, and the seriousness of that compared to maybe I won't spray for gray leaf spot. No, I don't think I'll spray for northern corn leaf blight. We know that you can still get some respectable yields if you choose not to do that.
Right.
With tar spot, trying to help folks understand just how different a disease, how aggressive it is, how it could limit yield has been really what I've spent the majority of my time the last 10 days or so really talking with folks about, because it is so new for us over here, Carl. What little bit we've had the last 2 years has been late season. It's caused issues with standability. We've not typically seen yield loss due to loss of leaf tissue. It's typically been standability late in the season with
Sure.
still respectable yields. And so trying to understand that, hey, we're significantly earlier than those infections have been in the past. Got to show some timelines and talk through the disease triangle like we always do to help folks understand.
Using an Olympic analogy here, Brian, if you bear with me, it's kind of like if you get tar spot late in the season and you don't see it in the foliage, awfully bad. You don't notice it on the combine besides standability, right? That's like the marathon runner that's just crashing across the finish line as opposed to, finishing out in good
Yeah.
stride. You had just enough in the tank for the corn crop to do its job, but you're probably going to feel it in the future. And I think that's kind of where you may see the tar spot ratcheting up in terms of pressure this year with some consequence.
Sure, absolutely. I want to circle back and I want to talk about corn aphids with you. That's not something that we typically see year in and year out, at least in eastern Indiana. I know that, you go out west a little bit further, that's a significant issue in most years, at least somewhere, for western corn growers. It is, I guess, the best way to put a nasty situation to be in. I mean, in terms of it is a really, I suppose gross is the appropriate word. When you go out into a field and you find the aphids, it is a nasty, sticky mess. But talk to us, I guess, first symptomology that you see and then the impact. How do we scout for these little boogers? Maybe even help us understand what a corn aphid looks like compared to, for some of our listeners, they'll certainly remember soybean aphids, not the same insect at all, but in that same family. So just talk us through all of that, because for a good chunk of our listeners, it's probably a very new pest.
Yes, no, I love the booger comment, the sticky situation that definitely describes corn aphids. So when you think about trying to identify this pest, it's very similar to any other aphids, like you said, in terms of soybeans. You're looking for kind of like the exhaust pipes going off the back. They've got kind of the black protrusions that go out off their backside, and so that's one of the best ways to differentiate them from other critters of a similar size. Oftentimes, the corn leaf aphids, they'll be similar in terms of color to the corn leaf. Almost that like green, blue green, sometimes kind of a yellow green look to them. And then I don't know, Brian, I call them like the size of the size of like of a pinhead. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like the little top of a pin, not the point of one. That's roughly the size that they look. In terms of scouting, it's like a lot of different insect pests or pests of that nature where you want to double check that it's not just in the perimeter of the field, not just along the grassiest boundaries, and that it is a whole field type of pressure situation. Oftentimes you'll find that it's just, a ring around the field. So as you're evaluating whether or not you should manage for any insect pest, encourage you to not just go 10 rows in or just get off the headlands. You got to maybe go, for those of us in irrigation world, a couple pivot towers in, walk until your pants are soaking wet at this time of year, if you're scouting in the morning, but make sure you get far enough in to get a good representative sample of the field. You'll know corn aphids because the way that they feed is they take up the sap of the plant, if you will, but they if I'm not mistaken, they extrude kind of this honeydew type of material. And so as part of that feeding process, what happens is you get this really sugary substance wherever corn aphids are. And then that lends itself to, you and I, we probably eat sugary foods, right? Same thing with anything in the natural world. That's a high impact, easily consumable substance. So anything's going to go after that. So you'll see saprophytic fungi, things that are, feeding on non-living organisms come in because that's a nice spot to hang out and it's easy. So you get this black sooty appearance is kind of how it's defined. And so that's a bad deal from the standpoint that if you get that sticky black soot on plant tissue, well, obviously you've got dusty solar panels there. You're not going to be as efficient in terms of harvesting solar radiation. That's the biggest challenge when it comes to after pollination. There are no economic thresholds that are defined with great, I don't want to say validity. Maybe it's more very low acceptance in terms of any economic thresholds. It's kind of one of those pests where it's like, if you have it and you have it late, it's probably not that big of a deal. But there's some new age thinking to the dusty solar panel, analogy for losing that solar, radiation potential. Then obviously we're decreasing yield. What I would say is more standard acceptance is if you have a cornleaf aphid population that's built up big enough that it's got that honeydew substance on the reproductive parts of the plant, if you're gumming up the tassels so it's interfering with the pollen coming out or gumming up the silks so that they're all balled up and you're not getting good pollination, that's the time where it's, okay, this is a problem. Oftentimes that's a sign of things are too late. So you're usually looking for the infestation as you go into tasseling because then there's the potential for that gumming up of the plants. So usually you'll see a spray recommendation as you have cornleaf aphids within the whorl as the tassel's coming out. Normally when I see them, it's right during pollination or after. We oftentimes don't treat for them, but this year, 2024, really wide planting window, right? For your latest planting corn, that's where I'd be scouting for cornleaf aphids. If you got them there, then it probably is worth that proactive treatment. And just to pay it all the way off, Brian, not all insecticides are labeled for aphids, so mind your label in that department. I do know, just with making some recommendations for folks, that bifenthrin containing products, that will get you by when it comes to aphid applications. I'm not advocating for this, but if you are making a fungicide pass and it's going alone without an insecticide, do your scouting, make sure that's a wise choice. And if you're choosing to use a generic insecticide, make sure that it is labeled for the spectrum of pests that are in your field. Just if you're making the pass anyway, make it the best pass that you can.
Yeah, well, and I'll echo that not only on the insecticide, but kind of circling back around to our tar spot conversation. Make sure that if you're wanting to try to make your own premix, whether that's insecticide or fungicide, be sure to check those labels because, as you clearly point out, not everything is labeled for aphids. Not every insecticide is labeled for tar spot either, and so be sure to check those labels. Uh, Carl, I guess I want to clarify just to make sure that we understand in your mind the delineation between I really do need to spray my aphids and no, I probably will get by is pollination or is it tassel emergence?
Yeah, this is a great question. You're going to find me fence squatting here.
Okay.
Going into pollination, if you have a population that's increasing, absolutely. I think it's that increasing population that's probably that line of demarcation here.
Okay.
I say that because aphid populations, they can grow really quickly and they can also crash really quickly. They're very much preyed upon by different diseases,
Yeah.
of an insect
Yeah.
of an insect nature. And then as conditions change, their populations also flux. So usually you see in droughtier situations, cornleaf aphids increase. There's this concept. This is getting really in the weeds, but I think it's like, is it the Brax is maybe the scale that's used for measuring the health of a plant? Really robust, healthy plants aren't targeted by insects. It's those that are under a little bit of stress
Yeah.
that somehow is sending out some, I don't know if it's a chemical signal or what have you. But the insects like those plants. So back to your original question, aphids, should I spray or not spray? Increasing population. The closer you are to pollination, the more likely I would advocate for spraying. But there's room for nuance in that discussion. I know there's other folks that are maybe a little bit more aggressive with a later application of an insecticide after pollination. Again, if you don't have that increasing population, you're probably not going to see the sooting up of those leaves. You're not going to lose that photosynthetic capacity of the upper part of the canopy. That's where you think of it. Treat it like a disease, right? If it's getting worse out there, probably should take care of it. But know that Mother Nature could take care of it for you here in short order.
Yep. Okay. All right. I saw, the communication between many of the pioneer agronomists over the last several days have included comments about corn aphid. It is not something that for me, having spent the majority of my career in Eastern Indiana and Western Ohio, that it's been something that I have dealt with on a yearly basis. It's certainly not chronic, but when you get it, it won't be hard to tell, I think is the key thing. If you walk out, as you described, well into your cornfield and you come back out and your shirt sleeves are sticky, or you've got, stickiness on your hands, that's probably a good indication that even if you didn't see the aphids, they are there. And you might want to
Sure.
turn back around and make sure to try to find where those aphids are located. Where have you found them most recently in the canopy? Are we talking about ear height and above? Is that where we're at for folks in
Yeah.
terms of scouting?
Keep your eyes up as you're going through your cornfield. It seems to me as though they're usually on the tassel. I don't know if they like to eat pollen or if there's something else that, is really driving them to be so high up in the canopy, but it's usually that upper cluster of leaves
Okay.
of the corn plant. So yeah, keep your eyes up in the canopy.
Okay.
Yep. Yep.
All right. Well, excellent discussion there on aphids. Maybe let's pivot just a little bit. A lot of talk over the last week or so about wildfire smoke and things like that. We talked about this a year ago quite extensively on the podcast. But Carl and I wanted to visit with everybody today about it a little bit because we are in a bit of a different situation. As Carl pointed out before we recorded, the smoke a year ago was probably more June, early July, and we were still into the vegetative growth stages for both crops and most of that time frame. Now we're in the reproductive stages. Cloudiness and limited solar radiation has a very different role or different impact when we are into these later parts of the reproductive stages of growth. And so, Carl, I guess I'd be curious your take on this with the smoke. It has increased a number of reports of wildfire smoke, not only out of Canada like we've seen before, but even out of, California. I think there's a good sized fire in Utah at this point as we record this as well. And so I guess your thoughts around overcast and smoke and some of those things.
Yeah, it's I never enjoy being like the bearer of bad news, Brian, so I don't want this to be colored that way necessarily. But if you could pick the worst time of year for us to have reduced sunlight, it's now, as you're going through that pollination process. So we talk about this as the peak water demand of corn plants and bean plants as they're going through their reproductive stages. It's really important that we limit the stress on the crop because all of those potential kernels, right? The embryos that do get fertilized, as you get the pollen landing on the silks, that's great, but it's the retention of those fertilized embryos. You can pollinate all the way out, kernels to the very tip of the ear, but the first ones to go are at the tip when you undergo stress. There's folks that'll say, hey, if I don't see tip back in my fields, that means I didn't push it hard enough. I didn't plant it thick enough. So I left some kernels on the table. I left some of those theoretical bushels on the table. Um, there's other folks that when they see tip back, they say, what did I do wrong?
Yeah.
Did I not feed the plant enough? Was it under too much water stress? What could be going on? And at that blister stage, as the embryo has been fertilized and you're getting rid of the silk and you're starting to commit some sugar into those kernels, that's where you're really vulnerable to that reduced photosynthetic capacity of the plant. So that's why you see us really trying to ensure a clean canopy and a well-fed plant as you go through that tassel timing. We don't want the plant to want for anything in that regard. That being said, the smoke from last year in June, as we looked back at that, the PAR data, what is that acronym? Photosynthetically active radiation or something to
Radiation.
that effect?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, so
Yep.
what we did is we evaluated at season's end how impactful was that smoke? And if I recall correctly, it wasn't even on the same order as a full overcast day.
Correct.
Yes, there was some haze and it reflected some of that sunlight back. At that time, we said good news because we were under some drought stress. Right now, we broke our drought across Indiana and Illinois with, like you said, with the hurricane that came through. We've had some really big precipitation events. So we've got enough water underneath a lot of these plants. What we want is to ensure that we have the sunlight to back those up. And I don't know, but as I look out my window here today, gray, overcast, full cloud day. That's less than ideal. This isn't the first time we've had cloudy days after pollination, though. So
Right.
for folks that are listening to this conversation, maybe they say, poo-poo that Eeyore. But I would say if I had to pick a cloudy week, this probably wouldn't be the one. And the last thing of note, you mentioned the California wildfires. I think we also at the end of last week caught a little bit of the Sahara Desert in Africa. It tends
Yeah.
to have, the dust blow into the
Yep.
tropics on an
Yep.
annual basis. With the way that the wind blew, we actually got a little bit of that in Indiana here. I think it was just for a day or two, but as you are looking out at your cornfields, having coffee on the porch and you see how wet things are, and then you notice how red the sun is in the sky. It's beautiful. But then you also remember that moisture, that free moisture, pretty good for disease development. That red ball that's in the sky as it's coming up, above the horizon, that's because of the poor air quality. You've got that much, particles that are diffusing the light, and instead of it
Yep.
being the bright yellow, it's the red. So that's how it strikes me. I'd be curious how it strikes Brian Shrader.
Well, you didn't say anything that I don't disagree with at all. I think the thing that your point about diffusion, anytime there's anything in the atmosphere, any particle, smoke, the sand you spoke about, anything, that basically, the way I think about it is it fractures the light. And so that
Yep.
PAR that you talked about falls. It's not as efficient of light. And we all know that the way to big yields is efficiency in everything. It's not, it's not just single faceted. You have to have everything go your way. And so I do think that we probably could see some impact. I'm a little reticent to get too aggressive. Your comment of Eeyore, I think probably is pretty right on for me. Because I was really concerned a year ago with the impact that I thought all of the smoke we had because it was so sustained, even with it
Yes.
being in the vegetative parts of the year. And so I'm kind of in a wait and see. I think if we could get some storms to build up and we could do some things there, you can flush, if you will, a lot of that particulate
Yep.
matter out of the atmosphere. So that could
Sure can.
change some things if that would happen. I don't know where we're at in all of that at the moment, to be fair, but it's something I think we need to think about, and maybe not in real time, but as we do the post-mortem on the season, and we always do one of those for the podcast, but if we do a post-mortem on the season, how much influence will we give to these issues that we're talking about in terms of quality of light compared to what we've done in past years? And so it's something to be cognizant of. We obviously can't change any of it at all, but I do think it's something that if you do go out into your field post-pollination and you start to examine things, you have to consider, boy, I did plant quite a bit of population. Maybe it should have been nose back. Maybe it shouldn't have been nose back this much. These are all, those mental calculations, the mental gymnastics, if you will, that have to be done when you're out evaluating your crop. We've had a good listener of ours ask about solar radiation. Brian, I'm sorry, I don't have that pulled up today, but we will report to you on what solar radiation has looked like this season. And then we will also take a look and try to figure out what that was, maybe before the wildfires showed up and then after the smoke from the wildfires, to see if we have seen any real difference. You probably are going to see some impact, Carl, but at this point, you just simply don't know what the significance of that impact will be.
That's right. Now, if folks are looking for that payoff a little more quickly, like Brian said, as you're evaluating pollination, split that ear off after you have brown silks. Split the husks off after you have brown silks. Pull the leaf sheaths of the ear, and then do a little shake test. You'll be able to see which ones detach and which ones hang on. Those that hang on, that means that we didn't fertilize those embryos. But then as you get some color in those kernels, that R3 growth stage, milk stage, roasting ear stage, at that point, that's when the corn plant's fairly committed to what it's going to hold on to. You can still see some abortion at that point. It's when you reach dough stage, R4. Then the plant is locked into whatever it's got in terms of the ear. Otherwise, the little bit of sugar that's at that R3 stage, it can abort the tip in order to retain the rest of the ear. So.
Yep. Well, let's maybe change the subject one last time here. I think there is something, Ben's not on the podcast, but I know he's gotten a lot of questions. There's been a lot of questions through the podcast about where we are at with southern rust because of the hurricane. I mentioned it earlier when we were just kind of getting things started. And so I guess two things I would ask. First, Carl, as you have been scouting corn the last week, have you found what we only, for us in the north, presume to be common rust? Has it become easier for you to find common rust?
The answer to that question is yes. I know of another entity up in Northeast Illinois that reports they found southern rust. To that, I would be surprised.
Okay.
And as our team's done some scouting in that general area, all we found is common rust. So take that for whatever it's worth. The diagnosis there for common rust and southern rust, it could avail some people, but the idea is that common rust, you can see it on the upper and the lower surface of the leaf. It is rust colored, whereas the southern rust usually contained to the upper side of the leaf, cinnamon, orange, burnt orange type of pustule color to it. Would be the 30-second version.
Yeah, I think also pustule size, I think sometimes can be a distinguishing difference in terms of just how raised they are. You'll have a significantly larger pustule, I believe, on southern rust than what you would experience on common rust. For the record, we did check IPM Pipe website that the podcast recommends very highly for those of you interested in diseases, especially for southern corn rust and for tar spot. Carl and I checked the southern corn rust IPM Pipe map this morning, and as of right now, the only county actually which was diagnosed officially on the 25th of July, so last week as we record the podcast, is Knox County in the state of Indiana. Now, with that said, Carl, I will point out that just across the river in Kentucky, Davies County, Kentucky, and Meade County, Kentucky, both have positives as well. So they'd be just right across the river for our Hoosier growers, Crawford County, Perry County, Spencer County, and Warwick County. So for those that aren't familiar with the deep southern reaches of the state of Indiana, that would be the 4 or 5 counties just literally on the river down there across from those counties in Kentucky. So certainly puts that well into play for those guys down south, our colleagues down there. But as of right now, anything north, I will stick by my conclusion that everything I have found has been common rust. And typically common rust is not a problem for us that merits any kind of fungicide application or anything. It's more of just a nuisance in terms of looking at it, but certainly not something that has any kind of yield impact for us here in the north, as long as it remains common and we don't get an odd year where we would have southern. And quite honestly, Carl, to be fair, north of Indianapolis, as an agronomist, I don't think I've ever actually been in a field with southern rust in the state of Indiana.
Sure.
So I don't know if you can say otherwise with that. I know. Do you have your own personal experience with southern rust?
I think in 2018 we might have found some up in Lake County, awfully late, if memory serves. But yeah, that's the only instance that I can recall being involved in anything related to southern rust. And we're blessed with all sorts of fun things up there. We talked about tar spot. I guess I just comment, Brian, one of the lookalikes that's troubling a lot of folks right now for tar spot is Physoderma brown spot.
Yeah.
Because right on the midrib, oftentimes you'll get a chocolate or a purple. Sometimes it can be dark enough brown that it looks like black, type of, it's not a lesion, but it's just, a discoloration in a circular form. And so if it's dark enough, people ask to the uninitiated, is that tar spot? Again, the reminder, tar spot, it doesn't rub off. It's often a little bit of a raised, piece of the leaf particle. It goes all the way through the leaf as it develops further. But Physoderma brown spot, just to pay that one all the way off. Oftentimes you'll see banding of the leaves, and it's an artifact of where the water sat in the whorl. And so you'll see that yellowing or brown, orange type of banding, across the full leaf surface. And then as the plant grew, then you see the green color again, but the water was still sitting in that part of the whorl. So then you see another band, and that's why you see Physoderma brown spot presenting the way it does. Not an issue. It's rarely leads to any yield reduction, and you don't have to have the brown spot to get the stalk rot and vice versa.
Yeah.
So just because you find one, you don't find the other. Last thing on that comment, Goss's wilt's the other thing we find from time to time up in Lake County.
Sure.
So
okay.
But yeah, that aside.
Okay. Well, we've kind of run the gamut today, Carl. Anything that we haven't talked about this morning that I would do listeners well to hear before our next update a week from now?
Ryan, I've got a pocket where we have some listeners kind of up in that Winnemac area, eastern Pulaski County, where we've gotten a boatload of rain, 10 inches in 5 days to some folks, 10 inches in 10 days to others. But for your late planted corn crop that has not, gone through the reproductive stages yet, it's not too late to make a rescue application of nitrogen. I think it was in 2014. Jim Camberato and Bob Nielsen, Tony Vine, if memory serves, put some nice studies together that showed a rescue application event at the R2 growth stage paid significant dividends. Once you get past that, as you start to approach that blister stage of corn where you're packing starch into the kernels, my impression is that you're remobilizing a lot of nitrogen within the plant itself. You're taking it from the leaves and the stalks and you're feeding the ears. So less so soil, applied. But for those folks that have the ability to irrigate on your field that's already wet as hell, that's a way to fertigate, get some nitrogen on the plant. But does that make sense to run the pivot when you're in that situation because you're sitting too wet? Y drops would be another opportunity. And just again, that idea of wet spots and that being where we're going to probably see the most efficient yields this year. Your yellowing highlighter green soybeans that you're wondering if you have a disease there, it's probably just because the nodules haven't fired all the way back up because they lag by a couple of weeks after they've been drowning in water. So don't get too bothered by that. Yep.
Any thoughts on how to come up with a proper nitrogen recommendation for these cornfields?
No, not really. It's throwing a dart.
Okay. No, I
But if,
understand.
outside of that off the cuff, somewhere around that 50 pounds or so. And this is
Yeah.
where I'm going to get myself in trouble with good agronomists here, crop physiologist. I figure, right, if you have a 200 unit nitrogen budget for, 200, 250 bushel corn, we're using round numbers here.
Yeah.
You've probably used somewhere around that 100 to 150 pounds by the time you get to tassel. And so that means you've probably got another 50 to almost 100 to go. So if we flushed a lot of that N beneath the root zone, I like the nice round number of 50 units of N probably is about what you're going to be able to make up. And if you do a whole lot more than that, I would feel pretty aggressive to me, but do your
Sure.
own trial work and tell me I'm wrong.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. I mean, that's certainly, we've not had those kind of rains on the eastern side of the state, at least in the geography that I'm responsible for. And so we're not seeing that. We're seeing some deficiency issues show here and there, but for unrelated types of reasons at this point. And so just trying to get a sense for those folks that maybe are listening that want to do that. What's the right number to start with? I think 50 is a fine number, Carl. I was just curious what your thoughts were on that. So
yeah, well, and as you get into more folks that are managing their nitrogen just in time, right? They're not putting a pre-plant pass on. You got with the planter a side dress. All of a sudden, you look at your field and you got stuff that has yellowed, fired up to your knees, in terms of the leaves, and you're questioning, all right, how much am I leaving on the table by not feeding this? That again comes back to the idea of don't wait till your corn crop's too far along to make that rescue application. But if it's hungry and you've had enough rain to get the nitrogen into the plant, then maybe we need to reevaluate our management plan there.
okay. Well, as we talked about earlier in the podcast, this really is agronomically one of those maybe dog days of summer is not the right one. Maybe it's Groundhog Day where every day's the same, but lots of different things to talk about. And so we wanted to cover the gamut a little bit today. As always, if you got something that you want us to talk about, please reach out to the podcast, one of the hosts, or however you want to get a hold of us, and let us know if there's a topic that you want us to cover or a guest that you would like for us to have on, inside or outside of the Pioneer Network. We love to get feedback from everybody. Was at a Pioneer meeting this week and was very encouraged by the number of folks that said they listened to the podcast and were talking to us, or listening to us, Carl, and getting good agronomic information. So we appreciated the feedback this week from all those folks that saw me and said something about the podcast. So any last thoughts before we get out of here for the week?
No, I think we've tortured these folks to death with good agronomic content and conversation, Brian. We can let them get back to the rest of their day.
All right, no problem. Well, Carl, if somebody heard something that you had said today that they'd like to get a little bit of follow-up information on, or reach out to you and follow along with what's going on in Western Indiana and a little bit of Eastern Illinois, how can they do that?
Yeah, let me know if I'm being too negative with the idea of cloudy days and, maybe some tip back stuff, or tell me I'm an idiot when it comes to how much N you should put on at this time of year for a rescue app. You can do so on Facebook at Joern Agronomy. That's Joern for Joern, and on X at Joern. How about you, Brian Shrader?
Yep. Best place to get a hold of me on social media would be Instagram, B_K_Shrader. And if you like what we are doing, please be sure to give us a thumbs up or a 5-star rating or a 4-star rating or whatever the situation is on your podcast platform of choice. It does help us know that we are doing things right or wrong, and we can make those pivots when we need to. And so with that, we appreciate listening. Hope you're having a good summer. Hope the crops look good in your part of Indiana or otherwise all over the Midwest, because we know we've got those listeners out there as well. So thanks for joining the podcast. We look forward to talking to you next week.
Thank you for listening to this episode from the Pioneer Agronomy team. Be sure to visit pioneer.com/podcasts to access additional episodes and learn more about our extensive on-farm data and innovative digital tools that are fueling forward-thinking farming.